So now we're going to demonstrate one of the most important stains in all of microbiology with the isolate that you had that was producing antibiotics. And so we're going to determine whether or not this isolate is indeed gram-positive or gram-negative. Now, in order to do a gram stain, you're going to do this at your laboratory benches, and you're going to need the following. You're going to need a slide. So I have a slide right here that we've already taken out. And what we're going to do, of course, is before we do anything with bacteria, we want to make sure that we label. So I'm going to take out my Sharpie, and I'm going to sort of label what I'm doing. So I'm going to put my initials, and then the initials of the bacteria, whatever one that I'm using. Again, retain the naming methodology that you had from your master plates. And then, again, I'm going to do the date. So today's date. And then I'm going to make a circle or square around where I'm going to put the bacteria on the slide, because note that bacteria are pretty clear as soon as you put them on, and they're very, very small, microscopic, so you won't know where you put them unless you mark it. Now, note that I've used a Sharpie for this. You're free to use things like wax pencils if you want. The reason that I use a Sharpie, of course, is because the black marking won't confuse me under the microscope, because sometimes the markings of a wax pencil look like gram-negative bacteria, and you don't want to get confused with that. But most of our dyes are alcohol-based. And if you know anything about Sharpie markings and alcohol, alcohol removes Sharpie. And so you don't want to have the Sharpie marking on the same side of your bacteria. So before you go on, flip over your slide. Okay? So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a small, tiny drop of water. You don't even need to squeeze this most of the time. So a small, tiny drop of water. And that's where we're going to be mixing our bacteria. The tinier the drop, the better. So again, we're going to use our loop for this. We're going to make sure that we sterilize our loop for about 5 seconds. It'll come out nice and red hot. You want to let that cool down for about 10 seconds. And what you're going to do, again, is you're going to just select a single colony. It's very important that you don't use too much, because if you use too much, when you look at this under the microscope, it's going to be too crowded for you to see anything. So again, just take a small dab of bacteria into a colony. And then you're going to take that and mix it with the water. And you want to spread out that water-bacterial mixture all over your slide so that you can fill up exactly the space that you grew out. Okay? So notice that this is now biohazardous, so you want to make sure that you incinerate that before you go on. Okay? Now, the next step, of course, is to let this air dry. You want to make sure everything is dry before you move on to the next step. Some people find this step boring or it takes too long, so there are these other processes that you can do. You can take out a lens paper book and you can kind of fan it off to make sure that it goes a little bit faster. Now, please do not wave it very aggressively over the slide, because you're going to make the bacteria go all over the place. Okay? Once it's nice and dry, and again, you want to be completely dry, is the heat fix step. Once you have it nice and dry, you have this incinerator that's nice and hot in front of you. What you can do here is wave it about an inch away from the incinerator for about 15 to 20 seconds. Now, please note that your fingers are a very good indicator of temperature. If your fingers are burning, so are the bacteria. And so you don't want to necessarily burn your fingers off in this step. You still need your fingers for the rest of the stain. So again, about 15 to 20 seconds will be enough to fix the bacteria to the slide. Remember, heat fixation is needed, because if I start putting dyes on here right now, the bacteria will simply run off the slide. So you want to make them stuck to the slide, but not melt them. Okay? Now, after about 15 to 20 seconds, you're going to come over to the ends of your desk on this sink. There's this thing called a slide rack. Now, the dyes that we're going to be using today are going to be crystal violet, iodine, alcohol, and safranin. Now, remember, alcohol and iodine are not dyes, but this is part of the gram stain procedure. So the first step it says to do, of course, is to flood the slide with some crystal violet. Now, note then that bacteria are completely covered, and you're going to wait about a minute for this to absorb into the bacteria. Now, as this is absorbing, we're going to explain what happens. So the purple dye is getting into the cell wall of the bacteria, and it's able to absorb because the bacteria itself has a negative charge, and then the dye will actually bind to it, and then it will stain the actual bacteria. Okay? Now, please also keep in mind that you have to have gloved hands in here, and that the purple dye may get on your gloves. Now, this is also where we can see whether or not sterile technique is being used, because lots of people put on their gloves and they touch their face. This dye will not come off your face very easily, and so we will know automatically whether or not you have good sterile technique. So after about a minute, you're going to want to rinse off that dye. Now, when you're rinsing off the dye, please keep in mind that you want to have it be a very, very slow trickle coming down the sink. Okay? So again, this is pretty good as far as the amount of water. You don't want to spray that directly onto the bacteria because remember, bacteria are very microscopic. This would be a fire hose if you did this directly to them. So the method that I like to use is to let the dye kind of run off and let it cascade down from the very top. Okay? Don't put that water directly on your bacteria, rather let it cascade down. Okay? At this point, you should see a little bit of purple on your slide. And so you probably can't see this very well on the video, but I do have some purple spots right there. And so the next step, of course, we're going to go on to immediately. Do not let this dry in between steps, is you're going to put on the iodine. Now the iodine here, again, you're going to simply flood it on top where your bacteria is. The iodine is going to act as a chemical mordant. Now what a chemical mordant is it actually binds around the dye to trap it into the cell wall. So this is allowing it to get nice and trapped. If you did not do this step, the dyes would simply wash out every time you rinse them. And so this is a very important step to make sure that you follow. Now this is the first step that you can also mess up, because if you leave this on too long, it will actually turn the color of the iodine, which is kind of a rusty color. And so that's not going to be very good to see under the microscope because you will not be able to tell if it's gram-positive or gram-negative. Okay? Also note that some people in your class may be allergic to iodine, therefore you do not want to touch them with your gloved hands. So please keep your hands and feet to yourself. Now the next step, of course, is to rinse that off. Now after about a minute, you're going to let that cascade down again. You're going to take your water and let it rinse off for about 3 to 5 seconds until that tannish color came off. At this point, your cells should still look purple. And again, if you look really close, they still look purple. Now, this next step is by far the most important step. This is the alcohol rinse. Now, the alcohol rinse is going to take off the lipids of gram-negative, but it won't do anything to the proteins, the peptidoglycan of gram-positives. Now, if you do this too long, however, it will start to make your gram-positives, which are supposed to be purple, look much lighter purple. And if you don't do it long enough, it makes your gram-negatives, which are supposed to be pink, look darker pink. And so that might be confusing. If you see a light purple or a dark pink, that might look like the same color and you won't be able to tell. So the maximum amount of time is 5 seconds with this. And that 5 seconds starts as soon as the first drop of this alcohol hits, and it stops as soon as you rinse it off. So I'm going to go ahead and get my water going again, ever so lightly. Now again, watch how quickly this goes. I'm going to start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? And so that's the good amount of time that you want to do this. Again, you don't want to typically go over 5 seconds because that's going to get rid of some of the gram-positive characteristic. Okay? At this point, you should be able to see whether or not you have gram-positive or gram-negative, because the gram-positives should still be purple, whereas the gram-negatives, if you took off the lipids, they're going to be clear. And so if we look at here, I'm pretty sure, since I still see purple, that this is a gram-positive, but in this, for the sake of completing the stain, we're going to go to the last step, which is adding the counter stain, which is the safranin dye. Now, if I had a gram negative, it would have been clear after alcohol step, and then it will turn pink at this step. If I did not have gram negative, the purples that I had for gram positive are still going to be purples. And so again, this step is 1 minute. So in reviewing the stain, we did the heat fixation, we did the crystal violet for 1 minute, we did the iodine for 1 minute, we did the alcohol for 5 seconds, and now we're doing the safranin for 1 minute. And you're rinsing in between the steps. Okay? Now, once you have waited about a minute, you're going to, again, rinse off the safranin. Okay? Now, after that, this slide is good to dry, and it has to be absolutely dry. So go ahead and dry off the backside. Very, very easy to dry off. Now, some instructors will tell you that you can lightly dab that water off. And if you're comfortable doing that, you may, but lots of students have trouble with dabbing and they'll wipe off their bacteria. So instead of dabbing, I recommend to lightly tap the slide. That will concentrate the water towards the bottom of the slide, whereas you can simply wipe the bottom of the slide because that's not where your bacteria is. Okay? Now you want to make sure that this slide is completely dry before you put it on your microscope. Okay, so you can use your fan to fan it off. You can also use the heat from the incinerator to dry it off. You want to make sure that absolutely this is completely dry before it goes on your microscope, because we will be looking at this under oil immersion, 1000x power on your microscopes. And trust me when I say oil and water don't mix. And so if you have any residual water, you will not be able to see your bacteria, and that's going to be rather frustrating. And so once you determine your gram type, this is going to go a long way at determining the species that you have for your identification reports. And so you're going to use the blast search, your gram stains, all of your biochemical tests to identify the bacteria that you have.